Good morning, everyone. I'm Liz Fernandez with the Professional Development Services Branch, and I'd also like to welcome you to today's webinar. Today our speaker is Dr. Ross Free. Dr. Free graduated from the Ohio State University College of Veterinary Medicine in 2006. He spent 3 years in mixed animal and large animal private practice prior to joining the United States Air Force as a public health officer in 2009. During his time in the Air Force, he obtained a Master of Public Health degree, deployed to Afghanistan in a preventative medicine role in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, and obtained board certification from the American College of Veterinary Preventative Medicine. He joined APHIS Veterinary Services in 2015 as the field epidemiologist for North Carolina and West Virginia. He joined the Swine Commodity Health Team in March of 2019. I'll now pass the webinar over to Dr. Free.
Okay, thank you, Liz, and thank you for everybody for dialing in today, and I hope it proves interesting and helps get some of these discussions started as a part of our ASF planning efforts. And so one that I want to talk about today was a draft ASF herd plan, and to kind of share and to hopefully obtain some feedback. Again, it's in draft form, so we're open to any and all recommendations at this point and thoughts, and hopefully it'll be a group effort of how to make this thing usable. So just an overview of what we'll go over today. We'll talk about the purpose of a herd plan and a little bit of background on herd plans, and then we'll go through the herd plan that we created section by section just to talk through it and kind of explain some of our thinking and rationale. Talk a little bit about potential issues with lagoon management, and then we'll also talk a little bit about a second ASF herd plan that we put together for non-commercial swine and some of the differences between the commercial version and the non-commercial version. I'll try to touch a little bit on indemnity and some of the process with that we're working through. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have some good questions or discussion. And again, just know that as we're working through this thing and trying to put it together, we'll take any feedback we can get. So again, as we walk through it, just know that we're open to any suggestions at this point. I just wanted to give credit to Dr. Nikki Humphrey. She and I helped work on this thing together as we tried to figure out some sort of simple and easy to use herd plan template that we could use. And this was geared towards the September ASF functional exercises. We wanted to have something in place that was usable if the states wanted to walk through this process for the September exercises, that they could use as a template to put together a mock herd plan for an ASF-infected farm for those exercises. And truthfully, what we did was we took the final herd flock plan template from HiPath AI and basically just modified it for use in swine and then specifically for ASF for these exercises. So just a background on what herd plans are and what purpose they serve. It's basically a roadmap when you have an infected prem for that premise to get through all of the processes that are required to go from diagnosis to restock and everything in between. And so it's an agreed upon plan for the state animal health official, typically the AVIC and the producer themselves, on how would this specific farm go from start to finish of becoming infected and then going through all the processes to get to restock. A herd plan can be modified if necessary, so if the farm and the state animal health official and the AVIC set out to create a plan for this farm and something's not going well or something needs to be modified, the herd plan can be changed throughout the process. It just has to be agreed upon by all of the parties who sign off on it. And one of the things that we talked about in our April ASF exercises, at least in North Carolina, is a herd plan template might be something useful for a farm to think about ahead of time of, if we had to go through this scenario, what would be the best choices for our specific farm based on a lot of different issues, like what type of farm is it, the geography, the environmental considerations, labor considerations, and that sort of thing. So obviously this is something totally different than a secure pork supply plan for a site, because this is a post-infection plan, but also something that could get farms thinking about what would we do on this specific site if we had to go through this process. So now I'll walk through kind of the step-by-step sections of the herd plan itself. And the first section is really just a farm information section, just some basic information on this premise, like the premise ID, who owns the premise and who owns the swine, if those are two separate people, and then who is the best contact person, the go-to person for information regarding all of the events going on this premise. It also has a box for the rough number of swine present on the farm, just to get an idea of how many animals we're dealing with here. The second part of the plan is the agreement section, and it's basically just saying that the owner of the PREM, the ABIC or incident commander, and the state animal health official have all reviewed this plan and are in concurrence that this is the best way for this farm to progress through the steps necessary to take care of this infected PREM. After that, there's a little bit of history information on here, not too much, but just some basic information about what were the clinical signs on this farm pre-diagnosis, what was the typical baseline mortality rate before the infection, and what did that rate change to in the days leading up to infection? What was the difference in what they normally saw for mortality and what happened right up before diagnosis? Also some information on when the samples were collected, the date that we had known positive results and the date that we had fatal positive results, and when the quarantine was issued. There's a little indemnity clause in the plan itself that talks about some of the agreements that would go along with indemnity and disposal of swine. The big thing here is that there should be a signed indemnity agreement before euthanasia and disposal start. And so right now we're looking at a 123. I know that the avian staff has a short form that we might be able to put together before the September exercise that we'll take a look at as well. But it just gives some general information about the indemnity and what goes along with that. And as well, it talks about any euthanasia, disposal, cleaning, and disinfection activities, if they're going to be paid for as a part of the herd plan, that there would have to be a separate financial agreement in place for that as well. The fourth part just talks about responsibilities on the farm and who will be carrying out the activities. And this could vary depending on what type of farm it is. So if it was a small backyard farm, potentially the state or federal folks might be carrying out the activities from start to finish. Potentially on a bigger commercial operation that could be carried out by the company itself. And so this section just seeks to spell out who's going to do the work as far as euthanasia, disposal, cleaning, and disinfection. The fifth part talks about movement restrictions on the farm and just some basic information about when the quarantine was issued, and also a few brief points about quarantine release, that there needs to be an epidemiologic investigation. We are working on a draft ASF Epi form, a short form, and hopefully, again, we'll maybe get that available by the September exercises if people want to try that out. Information about getting rid of contaminated materials, information about cleaning and disinfection, and environmental testing, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. The sixth part talks about the Epi investigation, that this needs to be conducted as a part of the herd plan agreement. We're looking at doing a 30-day look back, 2 incubation period look back as a part of the ASF short form investigation that we're trying to put together. And then we start to get into a little bit more detailed information in the herd plan of how these activities would be carried out. And again, I just want to stress a couple things. Number one, this is draft and subject to change. Number two, we didn't want this to be overly prescriptive. We wanted to give people an idea of what type of options might be available, but the herd plan itself is in a Word document form, so each farm could come up with their specific way that they were going to do things and type that in the blanks. And as long as everyone agrees on it, then again, we're not trying to be overly restrictive in these recommendations, but also just giving people an idea of what type of options might be out there. So again, this section is specific to euthanasia and depopulation. And in the red font there, we tried to list the AVMA approved methods of euthanasia, again, to give the PREM some sort of thought of what might be available and which ones they might choose. There's also some information on, when the euthanasia occurred or when it's scheduled to occur and when it's completed. And then following euthanasia, the next question would be, how is this farm going to go through the disposal process? And again, we try to give multiple options, but not to be too restrictive of disposal of animals and materials like feed that might need to be disposed of. And so we listed some different options to think about: composting on-site, off-site, burial, above-ground burial, incineration, and landfill. I think rendering is also a option as well that farms could think about. And again, it's all going to be site-specific and what can be done in that premise and in that state. And then the next stage of the process would be cleaning and disinfection of the PREM. And so it kind of talks about what needs to be cleaned and disinfected as far as the barns, the equipment, any vehicles. It talks a little bit about vector control as well as a part of cleaning and disinfection, that there needs to be some sort of rodent and vector control in place. It mentions a little bit here cleaning and disinfection of vehicles that were used as a part of the euthanasia and disposal process on the farm, and also cleaning of contaminated structures and equipment, and knowing that there might be some equipment that needs to be disposed of that couldn't be properly cleaned and disinfected as well, that could potentially be eligible for indemnity. And we gave a couple of options for virus elimination, and again, we're just trying to cast a wide net here to see if there's anything that we're missing, but one of the options that we found in the strategy document was cleaning and then doing a heating process of, a barn, and the numbers that we had out of the strategy document were 132, 133 degrees Fahrenheit for 70 minutes or 140 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes. And then we also gave the disinfectant option, and we pulled all of the currently approved ASF disinfectants off of the APHIS list, and so I tried to put those references at the bottom of the slide there as well if you're curious where we got these numbers or these list of disinfectants from. And obviously this list could be updated in the future as if any additional disinfectants get approval for use against ASF. The next part has a section for any miscellaneous farm issues specific to this premise. One good example I could think of that, let's say this is a backyard outdoor farm in an area that has feral swine. Part of the herd plan might want to address additional fencing or improvement of exclusion of feral swine, and how would the farm, if they were eligible to restock, how would they keep feral swine out? Would that be an issue for spread into feral swine or reintroduction into this herd from feral swine? So this is just a section that if there's anything specific to this farm that needs to be spelled out, that is identified during this herd plan process, that can be placed in this section. And then the restocking piece gets a little bit interesting, and this is probably where we could use quite a bit of feedback and help. At this point in time, we don't have an approved environmental sampling protocol for a farm that was infected with ASF and went through euthanasia, disposal, cleaning, and disinfection. There's no environmental sampling plan at this point in time. So what we did was we used a brief down period following cleaning and disinfection of 40 days in lieu of having a environmental sampling period where we would take samples from the barns and look for ASF viable virus at that point. So the 40 days is something that we've got as a placeholder, but if anybody has anything, you know, in the literature or any data that would support changing that time period, again, we're really in draft form and happy to reconsider or just make a better plan at this point. But the reason for the downtime is just we don't have anything environmental sampling-wise that we could use at this time. And then the other piece, along with repopulation, is we would use sentinel animals for a 15-day period and basically look for any clinical signs of ASF in those animals to make sure that all of the efforts that we'd done up to that point were effective and that we aren't going to completely restock, you know, with, say, 2,400 sows and then have a rebreak. We want to have some sort of sentinel period where we're putting in a few animals and looking to see, you know, if there's any evidence of rebreak at that point. And we came up with some restock monitoring cutoffs as well, and I work with some private practice swine veterinarians in North Carolina to try to come up with these of, if you restocked a farm post-ASF, what are some baseline numbers we could use that we would be concerned there was an issue going on and need to go in and do some diagnostic testing. So we asked for a 180-day restock surveillance period where we'd be looking at these numbers and to take action if we surpass these thresholds. So for nursing pigs, we set a 3% mortality rate in a 24-hour period or a 5% mortality rate in a 3-day period. Nursery pigs, 1% mortality rate in a 24-hour period or 2% in a 3-day period. Grow finish pigs, 1% in 24 hours or 2% in 3 days. And then for sows and replacement gilts, 0.5% mortality, excluding euthanized animals, in a 24-hour period, or a cutoff of 0.1% abortions in a 24-hour period. So essentially trying to get some sort of warning signal here that if we restock these animals and we started to get mortality creep, that we would know to take action and do diagnostic testing at that point to make sure ASF hadn't got back into the herd. One interesting discussion that we talked about in North Carolina, at least in April, is how would you manage a lagoon? And I don't have any recommendations or answers at this point, but we don't have anything in the herd plan right now about lagoon management. I tried to do a little bit of research just to see kind of what I could find or what was out there. And again, if we can get some sort of solid recommendation on management of lagoons on an ASF-infected print, we could potentially add that into the herd plan template. I found a paper on heat treatment of manure from swine lagoons, and unfortunately this is in a lab setting, so it may not be applicable to a large-scale lagoon. But they did some numbers on heat treatment of lagoons, and again, this is probably just something to continue the discussion, but they set the numbers of 65 degrees Celsius for 5 minutes. And again, I don't know if that's even remotely possible to heat up a lagoon like that, and there might be some people laughing out there, I'm sure, but this was just in a lab-type setting. And then they also looked at mixing in either sodium hydroxide or calcium hydroxide into the slurry and inactivating ASF virus. And so those were effective as well at different concentrations. There's probably going to be some issues there of can you actually mix in these chemicals with the lagoon and get them thoroughly mixed where you're inactivating virus? How do you dispose of the manure, and what's the appropriate disposal of manure with these caustic substances in it? even some human safety issues, I would imagine, that come with these chemicals because they're very basic chemicals. But anyway, just a couple of things maybe to spark the conversation, and maybe other states have had these discussions as well, as how would you treat a lagoon on an ASF-infected prim. And like we mentioned earlier, we came up with 2 herd plans, one for commercial swine and one for non-commercial or outdoor type swine specifically, and kind of realizing that a cleaning and disinfection on an outdoor prim would not be feasible. So in the non-commercial plan, what we ended up coming up with was a 120-day fallow period following euthanasia and disposal. We talked a little bit about adequate fencing, especially if you're in a state with feral swine. Vector control would be a part of that as well. So we tried to come up with an alternate plan for outdoor raised swine and farms that you couldn't necessarily do a cleaning and disinfection. And again, the difference in the non-commercial as well is the 120-day fallow period for restock requirements, but followed by a sentinel animal period. Talk just a little bit about indemnity. We had a draft document that's still a draft document for the ASF, the very first ASF exercise last November, that we'll probably continue to use for the September exercises, where we would plan on paying 50% of fair market value for swine that had to be euthanized as a part of an ASF response. And this draft document as well talks a little bit about reimbursement for depopulation and disposal activities and virus elimination activities. You know, one of the arguments for allowing the farms to do their own euthanasia, for allowing the farms to do some of the work on their own, whatever that amounts to, virus elimination, is that if they're reimbursed for that work, that might keep their employees engaged and available for when they finally do get to restock, and try to help ease the burden of the financial loss of not having pigs on the prim for an extended period of time. So I think some of the next steps that we need to look at are what would be the rates of reimbursement for these September exercises, something that we could potentially use for the exercises to say, if the farm chooses to use a contractor versus doing their own labor, and what will we reimburse the farm for that labor. As far as appraisal goes, specifically appraisal of the animals, currently we're planning on doing this on a 123. And again, the avian staff does have a short form that we might look at adapting for the exercises in September. We have a swine indemnity calculator that we update every 3 months. And so the current calculator in place covers July, August, and September of this year, which would get us through the ASF exercises. And it's based on prices that we pull off of this Livestock Marketing Information Center website. The calculator itself, it's pretty detailed, and so it tends to break out into pre-weaned pigs, feeder pigs, growth finished pigs, and then market weight pigs. There are also separate calculations for boars, replacement gelts, and sows, and the sow calculations also take into account weight, what their parity is if they're pregnant or open, and multiplier animals would be a little bit more valuable, obviously, than sows on a typical sow farm. So the data that we would need for doing an indemnity on an infected farm gets pretty detailed, and we would basically need the number of animals and the approximate weights so that we could plug those into the calculator and put them in a 123 to calculate the final indemnity. So just in review, these herd plans are meant to be a roadmap for a farm once it's infected to go through every single phase of activity from the date of detection to the date of restock, and then it's well thought out, well planned out, well agreed upon by all the parties who need to be on the same page. And again, they could potentially be just a good thought-provoking exercise for a farm to think, what would be the options on this farm? You know, we know the water table's too high, so how would we do disposal here type thing? The indemnity for swine needs a pretty detailed inventory, and that inventory and 123 needs to be agreed upon before the euthanasia activities begin. And that's pretty much all I've got. So again, I hope that you all understand, you know, it's a work in process, and we're happy to take feedback, and whether that's on this call or just email as you think about things, be happy to just improve it and try to continue to make it better as we approach the end of September. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, as we move into Q&A, please feel free to place yourselves in the question queue by dialing #2 on your telephone keypad. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, at which point please then state your name and question. You can also submit questions in writing by using the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please remember to select all panelists from the drop-down menu before submitting your question.
We do have one question, Ross. They're wondering if it's possible to email that presentation to one of the participants.
Yeah, that'd be great. If anybody wants a copy of the the presentation, just shoot me a note over email, and I'll send it back to you. It'd be too easy.
Okay.
All right, we do have a caller in the verbal question queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hey, I didn't see anything about tick sampling in your environmental plan, or, I heard what you said about the environmental plan, but are you looking at doing any tick sampling on the depopulated premises or any surrounding premises?
Yeah, and you said tick sampling, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I suppose it would probably depend on the state where the detection was made. So, if it was in a southern state where soft ticks that would serve as potential vectors, might be a concern, especially if it was a outdoor, pasture pork type farm. That'd be something valuable to put in that vector control or, whatever the state and the AVIC wanted to come up with. And, if it was in a northern state where that wouldn't be an issue, then probably something they could leave out. So, I don't have anything detailed, specific to ticks, but I think that'd be a site-by-site or state-by-state interesting thing to throw in there, too, if they wanted to do any, tick drags. And I think soft ticks are a little bit harder to surveil for, and I'm not an entomologist, but my understanding is they tend to burrow, so I don't know if you pick them up on a tick drag or not, or even picking them off of wildlife or something like that. So that'd be an interesting thing to think about, depending on where the farm was and if they wanted to add that into the herd plan. That's a good question.
We have another written question. I guess it's actually more of a comment. You may want to include a checkoff to say that the farm has a Prem ID number in addition to Sam's and Dunn's number for speedy reimbursement if that is still required.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know that the first part of it does, list the Prem ID number, but that's a great point for reimbursement. That there does need to be a Sam's and Dunn's number for that to go through. So, yeah, we'll think about adding that as well. Like you said, just a verification that it exists. It probably doesn't need to go on the herd plan itself, but just that they have one. That's a good thought.
Okay, we have another written question. Regarding the fallow period on outdoor farms, will you consider seasonal factors, cold, humid, wet conditions? Yeah,
and we're wrestling a little bit with that fallow period, too. A lot of the literature I've seen in ASF survivability, there are seasonal components where I think the virus survives a little bit better in cool weather versus hot. And, there's really a wide range of numbers out there that I've seen of how this virus actually survives in the environment. So we use the 120, but again, not meaning this to be overly prescriptive. If you were in, say, North Dakota in the farm broke in December, you might adjust. I guess it just depends on the situation, and I suppose those numbers could be adjusted if there was a good rationale for either making the fallow period longer or shorter.
We do have another written question, and a thank you, Ross, for broaching the subject. It will be on the table for day 3 activities for the exercise in September, and kudos to the swine staff for bringing this forward. How do we conduct environmental sampling using our current tools? Are any of the labs working on appropriate media sampling methods or prep for the PCR use?
For environmental sampling, is that what the question was about?
Correct.
Yeah, I think, we want to bring that issue up and just see if there are any opportunities for, validating some sort of environmental sampling protocol. So, yeah, we are thinking about that. Again, we don't have any detailed plan in place at this point, but that's a discussion that's been ongoing, at least for us on the swine staff. Is there any way to look at doing an environmental study that would maybe coincide with some sort of other ASF study where you'd already have pigs and manure and, the right conditions present where you could potentially do a post-ASF study, environmental study type thing. So that's something we're definitely looking at this point. We just don't have any approved methods just yet.
Okay, we have another question. In signal pigs, what is the required diagnostic testing of sick pigs? Necropsy with spleen, tonsil, blood, lymph nodes?
Yeah, so right now the approved tissues for, pigs that die on farm or are euthanized, we could do spleen or tonsil or lymph node as a part of that necropsy. And then, sick animals that are still alive or potentially even just animals in the sentinel pen with sick animals, you could do whole blood on those as well. So as far as I know, those are all of the approved samples at this point.
Okay, the next question is, the herd plan is voluntary, correct? And would there be any incentives for producers to complete it?
So that's a great question. I don't know if the herd plan is actually voluntary. I suppose, the state, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong here, but the state could make a herd plan a requirement if they actually wanted to restock. I'm not quite sure on the legality of, do they have to have a herd plan or is it voluntary? I just wasn't under the assumption that it was voluntary, especially if the farm actually wanted to, have animals on the premise again. And if I can certainly follow up on that and just see if there's anybody knows more than me on if it's voluntary or not. I had not heard that before.
Okay. Would drag swabbing allow a farm to confirm proper C&D completion?
Say that one more time, Liz. Drag swabbing?
Yeah, the question is, would drag swabbing allow a farm to confirm proper C&D completion?
Yeah, so I'm assuming they're asking about swabbing of, say the barns and the pens and whatnot. And again, we're looking at, could we create some sort of environmental sampling protocol for post-ASF verification of cleaning and disinfection, but currently that doesn't exist, and that's why we went with the downtime post-C&D before restock, because there's no approved environmental sampling protocol in place right now.
Okay. Another question is there an MS Word document of the plan that can be used as a template?
Yep. And so, again, it's a draft document right now. I can talk to Barb Porter-Spalding at NPIC if that's something we can send out prior to the September exercises for the states who are participating to use as a template, if they want to use that for the September exercises. What I'd like to do is, as we get more feedback, I'll try to continue to update the draft, make it a little bit better, and then we'll try to, as long as it's okay with NPIC, get it sent out for those September exercises.
Okay. Would the 40-day fallow period start after the pigs are removed from the premise or once all the feed/lagoons are managed?
Yeah, so the fallow period, in my mind, would start once all the cleaning and disinfection work was complete. So, you know, after all of the contaminated material has been removed and, you know, the barns have been cleaned and disinfected and that process has been signed off on, then you'd start counting your fallow period or your downtime after that process was done. And so for an outdoor, you know, backyard type prem where there's no cleaning and disinfection, it'd be from the date that the euthanasia and disposal, the euthanasia was completed and the animals were removed to wherever they're going to be disposed, and all the contaminated materials that couldn't be cleaned and disinfected were also removed from the farm. Then you'd start your 120 fallow day count from that.
And Ross, can you repeat your email address?
Yep, you bet. It's just Ross, R-O-S-S, .A as in alpha, .free, F-R-E-E, at USDA.gov.
Okay. People are asking for that, so I'm sure you're going to get a bunch more emails.
Yep, you bet.
Another question is, you mentioned that a detailed inventory would be necessary prior to any euthanasia. For certain transitional swine herds where an accurate inventory might not be possible initially, would a signed indemnity request form allow depopulation to proceed without a complete inventory, or VS1-23, as has been allowed with poultry?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, yeah, it's something that we're going to look at. Can we create a short form leading up to these September exercises, something that the owner and the state and the AVIC would agree to for starting depopulation without a signed 123? Because I think I mentioned that earlier, that the poultry staff, I think it's called a Form A1. So we'd look at, before the September exercises, can we get some sort of short form potentially put together for that reason? You know, if the 123 was going to cause a major delay in activities, just like the poultry staff do, would there be some shorter form we could use to get things rolling?
Okay, we have a couple more questions. I think what they mean is, it says, can a premise clear for repopulation without necropsy of sentinel pigs?
So the sentinel pigs would be the first phase in repopulation, I guess, where we'd put in, you know, a few animals. And again, right now the herd plan says we would do ASF testing on any, you know, basically sick or dead pigs that come up during that time. So obviously if you get through your 15-day sentinel period and everybody's healthy and happy, then that would kind of be the next step to move into further restock, if that makes sense.
Okay. And this is more of a comment. The herd plan is not voluntary if a site wants to receive reimbursement for depopulation and disposal activities.
Okay. Yeah, and I hadn't heard of the herd plan being voluntary either, so that's good to know.
Okay, let's see what else we have. So in California for VND, we attached the flock plans to the premise quarantine. This is what gave us authority to enforce the conditions of the flock plan. I do not know how this might be done in other states. Okay. We do have someone that wants to have do a verbal question. Tegan, can you explain how to do that?
Absolutely. If you'd like to ask your question verbally, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad. All right. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Good morning. This is Dr. Brightbill from Pennsylvania. I would just have a suggestion as we think about going forward. One experience we've had in PA, especially with CWD, we're always meticulous. We do the herd plan before any indemnity. paperwork is presented for the farm to sign off on. We did have a recent poultry depop where that order got a little mixed up and the indemnity paperwork was signed before the herd plan. And in the end, the producer did not agree to sign the flock plan, and USDA and PDA had to tell them, don't worry, this will never happen to you again because you won't have the opportunity because, you know, we are paying you indemnity, but because you didn't choose to follow the flock plan, you won't get it again. And so I would just encourage, I like to hear what California is doing. I think including the herd plan along with the quarantine is a smart idea. You definitely want to get that herd plan agreed to by all three parties and signed before you allow the entity to sign on the bottom line for indemnity, because if it's done in the wrong order, you could potentially be in kind of precarious situation legally of having to deal with somebody that doesn't plan to follow through and may jeopardize the health of the state and nation by not complying.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you for mentioning that.
Okay, we have a lot of people that want your presentation, so we can definitely get that out to everyone. I will, if a participant signed in with their email, I can go ahead and send that presentation out as a PDF.
Yeah, that'd be great. That's fine, if you don't mind.
No, not a bit. And the one comment that came from Barb was that we will be sending out the template herd plan as part of the policy docs for the September exercises.
Okay.
That's information to have.
So yeah, I appreciate any and all feedback, and we'll try to update this thing as we get closer to September and make it a little bit better, and hopefully we'll be able to try it out in a hypothetical version in the September exercises.
Okay. Do we have any more verbal or written questions? I have no written questions in the queue.
I'm not showing any at this time. Again, if you would like to ask your question verbally, dial #2 on your telephone keypad. If you want to send your question in writing, use the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Just remember to select all panelists from the drop-down menu.
This is Greg Mayer from FATL. My one question for you is there no, ASF is not a human pathogen, and yet the plan doesn't seem to in any way suggest that we might be sending market weight hogs to slaughter to use the meat. Is that off the table?
Yeah, it's a good question, Greg, and for the, so I guess for the euthanasia section specifically, again, I guess the point is I tried to put the options, but just because the option's not listed on the template doesn't mean it's not a possibility. So there'd probably be some hurdles there of could you get a plant to take those animals, and then what would you do with the meat? Where would that meat go and whatnot? I know we talked about that a little bit, at least in our North Carolina exercises in April of, you know, if you had a plant that you could use for euthanasia activities, you know, would that be a possibility? So that'd be a state-by-state decision as well, I would think, of, you know, is that a potential way to send animals and not do on-farm euthanasia? But there's probably also some hurdles to get through there where these plants are private companies. I can't imagine we could mandate they would take the animals if they didn't want to type thing. But, you know, a good thought and potentially an option. And again, just because it's not on the template doesn't mean that it couldn't be used.
Thanks.
We do have another written question. Is there any move to validate a PCR test with the saliva rather than blood, whole blood, to make it easier to conduct surveillance testing?
Yep, that's a good question too. So I know that, you know, the swine industry uses oral fluids for surveillance, routine surveillance work on a constant basis. I do think there's a validation study ongoing where they did some work in Winnipeg, and Greg, Dr. Mayer, you would know more than me, but I don't think the data has come out on that yet, but I do believe they did the initial oral fluid validation work, and there might be some more work on oral fluids and validating for ASF surveillance in the future, as far as I know.
We are planning more work, yes.
Yep.
No, there's a question about the exercise in September. Is North Carolina's exercise in September a full exercise with depop and disposal?
So I don't think we're actually doing any depop and disposal, and if any of the State Department of Ag folks are on, they can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're going to, as far as I know, walk through the process from start to finish of all the phases of ASF detection, you know, hopefully all the way through, and type, you know, what we would do on a certain farm. I don't think there's actually going to be any euthanasia disposal activities that physically occur, and I don't know if Dr. Nault or Dr. Mekas are on to verify that. I think I mean, my understanding is I think it's just hypothetical. Is that, hopefully that answers the question.
Michael Nault said we have a separate training going on the week before. There's another question. Do you have special activities for surrounding area? For example, do you specify infected zone, buffer zone, and else? And what do you have to do in each zone?
Yeah, so I think some of that planning is ongoing as well. On, you know, a state level of, you know, Dr. Zach had a really good presentation on Tuesday about traditional surveillance zones versus network approaches to creating a control zone. And, you know, especially as these vertically integrated companies where you're moving pigs routinely from one site to another, you know, potentially the approach from a network standpoint is something that we would really need to look at for creating a control zone. There, you know, I think in North Carolina, one thing that we've looked at in our exercises is doing a little bit of a hybrid of part of the control zone being a geographic area and part being a network type control zone, depending on movement of pigs and shared labor and different things like that.
Okay. Do we have any additional written or verbal questions?
I'm not showing any other verbal questions at this time. Again, if you'd like to ask your question verbally, dial #2 on your telephone keypad, or submit your question in writing using the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Just remember to select all panelists from the drop-down menu before submitting your question.
Okay, I don't see any additional questions. I'd like to thank Dr. Free for his participation and today in this webinar, and thanks everyone that joined. I'd like to thank everybody that joined us today. Our next webinar will be on Tuesday, August 20th with Dr. Fred Bourgeois, and his topic is the EMRS Permitting Gateway, and that's in preparation for the functional exercise in September. And we also have a webinar scheduled on Thursday, August 29th with Tony Pearson, and Tony's webinar will center around the global African swine fever situation and the critical biosecurity and hygiene concerns in depopulation, I cannot say that word, and disposal and truck sanitation management. And with that, I will bid you all a great afternoon, and thanks again for joining us.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Events Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.